Hello everybody, I'm Sandra Schwab and you are listening to a reading from my upcoming novel, Springtime Pleasures. Chapter 1, in which our story opens with wild boars, highwaymen and an early morning stroll up St. James's Street. Spring 1817, somewhere north of the Tweed. When the century was still in its teens, and on one surprisingly sunshiny day in April, they drove up to the rusty gate of Miss Pinkerton's Academy for Young Ladies on Chiswick Lane, a large battered coach, with 2 fat horses and a fat coachman, his face mottled with hectic red. A scrawny youth, who sat on the box beside the rotund coachman, bit his nails, tugged at his sweaty hair, and scrambled down the box as soon as the coach drew up opposite Miss Pinkerton's spotted brass plate. St. Cuthbert's Academy for Young Ladies, it read with old-fashioned and neoclassical flourish. One corner was dented, and below the latter somebody had scratched a leering face. It might have been the face of a gargoyle, or perhaps the scratch had simply not been used to working with brass. But the scrawny youth ignored these artistic endeavours altogether, and instead pulled the bell hard enough to make it bleed like the heavenly trumpets on doomsday. At the din, at least a score of young heads were seen peering out of the narrow windows of the once stately brick house. Indeed, the bell sounded loud enough to be heard even in Miss Pinkerton's private upstairs parlour, where she was presently entertaining 2 of her hopeful pupils with seed cake and her usual parting speech, which typically covered such topics as the evils of the world outside, be true to thyself, and upholding the spirit of St. Cuthbert's even and especially in times of adversity. This part also covered a discourse on the importance of carrying your needlework with you at all times. Ah, Miss Jemima Pinkerton interrupted herself when the bell tolled. That will be Mr. MacFarlane's carriage come to carry you away from us. She bestowed a slightly misty smile on the 2 young ladies sitting in front of her, in appearance as different from each other as night and day. One small and plump, with curly blonde hair and an English milk and roses face, the other tall and thin, her dark hair almost black against the Celtic paleness of her skin, the intense green of her eyes partly hidden by a pair of brass spectacles. Well, my dears, Miss Pinkerton could feel her smile becoming even mistier than before. Remember what I told you about the excellent uses of oxgall soap, in particular in regard to removing bloodstains from delicate fabrics. Yes, Miss Pinkerton. The 2 girls nodded earnestly, their fresh young faces still innocent and untouched by the fate that awaited them. How would they fare in far-away London? Miss Pinkerton had led them this far, and now she had to trust that the spirit of St. Cuthbert's would carry them safely onward. Miss Pinkerton removed a lacy handkerchief from one of the sleeves of her dress and delicately dabbed the corners of her eyes. Well then, she cleared her throat and roused herself from sentimentality. Girls, the world awaits you, she said grandly as she sat to all of her pupils about to leave the bosom of her school. I hope you will do St. Cuthbert's proud. Again the 2 heads bobbed up and down. Yes, Miss Pinkerton. Satisfied that she had done her best, the schoolmistress handed the 2 girls the letter for her parents, or, in Miss Stanton's case, for the girls' aunt and uncle. It behooved the schoolmistress to write to the parents about their daughters' accomplishments upon the girls' parting from school, and to include the last bill, of course. The letters having thus been dealt with, Miss Pinkerton reached for the 2 larger parcels on her desk. Dear Dr. Johnson, she said, such a revered gentleman. His work, she patted the parcels, will do you many good too, no doubt. He was much taken with St. Cuthbert's, as you know. A dreamy smile appeared on Miss Pinkerton's face. Who could forget those immortal lines, addressed to a young lady on quitting St. Cuthbert's on Chiswick Lane? Why, he even included some verses from our old school song. Grab the nearest. Yet just as Miss Pinkerton was about to launch into song, the door burst open and a scrawny boy stumbled into the room, his eyes wild. "Ah," the schoolmistress said, "you've come about." "The boar!" the boy gasped. The two girls eyed his distraught frame with interest. "The boar?" Miss Pinkerton echoed, clearly perplexed. "Not the coach?" "The bestial boar! It's back in the village!" Miss Pinkerton's face fell. "Oh dear," she said, while the boy's face in turn crumbled. "It's horrible, horrible," he whispered brokenly. Miss Pinkerton blinked, obviously taken aback by so much despair. "Nonsense," she said briskly, before she turned to her girls. "Miss Proquin, please hand the young gentleman a slice of seed cake. Nothing like seed cake to revive the constitution, mark my words. And now, my dears," she looked from one young lady to the other and smiled, "go and get the guns." Now, as you can see, our heroine, Miss Carlotta Stanton, has enjoyed a rather unusual upbringing. It doesn't help matters that Charlie is also afflicted with an unfortunate height and a pair of really, really, really ugly brass spectacles. So, when she's introduced into London society, she's soon assigned a place among the wallflowers. But then she befriends Lady Isabella, and through her she meets our hero, Isabella's brother. George Augustus Griffin, Viscount Chanderley, has to marry fast. His father has ordered him to find a suitable wife this very season. Now, where do you usually meet eligible young people of the opposite sex in that time and age? At balls and assemblies, of course. But here's the problem. Poor Griff doesn't like dancing. So when Charlie meets him at a ball, he's not in the best of mood to begin with, and then his sister makes matters worse by making him ask her new friend to dance, which is where this next scene starts. With a forced smile, Chanderley held out his arm to Charlie. "Shall we, Miss Stanton?" Charlie was of a mind to tell him to go to the devil, but at Lady Isabella's beaming face she found she did not have the heart to disappoint her new friend. "With pleasure." She slipped her hand into the crook of his elbow and then remembered to tack on, "My lord." The muscles under her fingers were rather stiff, and the lines around his mouth seemed to deepen as he led her to the dance floor. Indeed, he looked very much like a man on the way to his own execution. Charlie frowned. Surely her tallness could not affect him in such an extreme manner, or could it? "If you'd rather we didn't," she began tentatively. He pressed his lips together and shook his head. Then he glanced down at her. "I'm afraid you will find me an indifferent dancer, Miss Stanton. My technique is far from splendid, and I'm sadly out of exercise in the art of the country dance. So I fear you will be in for a disappointment." Charlie searched his face. All in all, it was a rather nice face, despite its stern aspect. His chin was square and firm, the shape of his lips rather becoming, the nose straight and slightly bony, and his eyes the colour of a horse chestnut. A lock of blonde hair flopped endearingly down over his forehead. As he watched, a nerve jumped in his cheek. It occurred to her then that the poor man was probably horribly nervous. Mr. Bernstone, the music teacher, had warned them that there existed gentlemen who might feel uncomfortable dancing and who had a propensity for stumbling over their own feet. One had to look at such unfortunate persons with charity, he had impressed upon the girls at St. Cuthbert's. Under no circumstances must such poor people be teased or bullied, or their frocks decorated with slips of paper bearing comic inscriptions. After listening to the deprecating remarks made about her own person, Charlie was in no mood for teasing anybody this evening anyway, and so she adjusted her spectacles with her free hand and gave Lord Chanderley an encouraging smile. If he was indeed so bad at dancing, it was no wonder the poor man looked like 3 days of torrential rain. "I believe we will get on famously," she said, and made her voice light. "Listen, it's a slow dance they are playing. We will do splendidly, I'm sure." He inclined his head. "As you wish." While he led her to a place in the long row of dancers, Charlie cast about for a subject that would put him at ease. Her acquaintance with gentlemen being somewhat limited, this presented a problem. She supposed that Mr. Bernstone did count as a gentleman, even though he was only a music teacher. But he was a very good music teacher, and besides had a friend in faraway places that regularly sent him copious amounts of Turkish delight, which he was rather happy to share with the whole of St. Cuthbert's. Apart from music, Mr. Bernstone was rather fond of fishing. On a sunny day, he could be often found standing in the shallow stream not far from the school, casting his rod and letting the line dance over the water. The only streams Charlie had seen in London had been the Thames and the Serpentine in Hyde Park. She had not detected anybody fishing in any of these waters, but the topic was worth a try. Didn't gentlemen spend a lot of time in the country in the summer and the autumn? They would be able to go fishing then, wouldn't they? And so, when they first met in the course of the set, Charlie gave Lord Chanderley a sunny smile and asked, "Don't you find fishing extremely exciting?" When she took the proffered hand, something like a tingle shot up her arm, and she had to fight hard to keep the smile in place. His hand was large, and even through both their gloves she could feel the hardness of his palm. 1, 2, they stepped towards each other. "Oh my," she thought, her breath hitching in her chest. With his fingers closed around hers, she could now feel their strength and their size. Her hand felt positively dwarfed within his. 3, 4, they stepped back. "Fishing?" His brows rose. In contrast to the rest of his hair, they were dark, almost black, and very bushy. 1, 2, and around in a circle. Heat radiated from his body, and a scent, a very nice one, very masculine too. Indeed, he was a very masculine man, being so tall and, well, becoming. "Personally, I find catfish a bit of a nuisance," Charlie said, her smile still firmly in place despite the tingles that seemed to have taken up residence in the pit of her stomach. "Not only are most of them so monstrously big as to make it a real effort to track them out of the water, but skinning them is rather tedious work too." He gave her a blank look. Perhaps he had never caught catfish before. Therefore Charlie elaborated her point when they met again. "Cutting the skin beneath the head and then pulling it down, I mean. Tedious. And your hands stink." She thought about this for a moment. "Well, perhaps not as bad as scraping the scales off and getting them all over you, though. But breaking their backbone to get the innards out, no, that I wholly detest. Truly, it makes me shudder just to think about it." She gave a tiny shudder to prove her point, but also because it felt so very delicious when Lord Chanderley held her hand in his. She had not known that holding somebody's hand could evoke such feelings, overwhelming feelings. She wished they could dance the waltz so he would hold her hand all the time. But she had been told that young girls did not dance the waltz in London. It would be most improper, which was a cross unfairness if she now thought about it. They went around and around each other again. "Well, better than eels, I suppose," Charlie remarked somewhat absent-mindedly, because she was inwardly still smarting about the waltz. "Slimy, slippery things, eels, but they taste nice." With a regretful pang she let his hand go as she moved back in line. "Do you like eels?" she asked the lady standing next to her. She gave Charlie a confused look. "Eels? Is that a new poet?" "A poet?" Charlie blinked. "No, it's a fish." She shook her head. My, but the people of London were a strange lot.